Good morning, welcome back. Today is August 14th, and I've got a lot of good stuff that happened on this date, so let's get right to it. It was on this date in 1040 AD in Scotland that King Duncan I was killed in battle against his cousin Macbeth, who succeeded him as king. Now, this is a real event, real people, and it has nothing at all, little at all, something to do with a certain play that was written about this scenario. Details were changed, but certain play written by a certain playwright that we won't mention the name of this play that celebrates the historic victory of King Macbeth over King Duncan of Scotland. That was in 1040 AD. In 1765, British colonists in Boston held their first public act of defiance against the Stamp Act at a large elm tree very near to Boston's City Hall. In Boston. This large elm tree became a meeting place, and actually it was referred to as the Liberty Tree. And it became the central meeting point for the next 10 years for Boston patriots who were there to complain about the king, Britain, or demonstrate in favor of independence. In 1765, 10 years later, it was cut down. No longer exists. It was cut down by some British loyalists who figured it was a good thing to get rid of this. 1775, it was cut down by British loyalists. In 1908, there was a Springfield, Illinois race riot having to do with strikes and work on the railroads, I believe. But it's kind of interesting that this took place in Illinois, Springfield, Illinois, in 1908 on this date. It's also VJ Day in 1945, Victory in Japan Day. This was the day that the Japanese offered their surrender. If you know the picture, if you've ever seen the picture of the sailor kissing the nurse in Times Square, well, that was taken on this date in 1945. Birthdays today include American dentist John Holliday, born on this date in 1851. Now, most of you are thinking, who is American dentist John Holliday? Well, you may know him better by his nickname, Doc Holliday, and his role in the great shootout, the gunfight at OK Corral, or the shootout, or whatever it's called, and his partnership with Wyatt Earp. If you watch the movie, I believe Doc Holliday is played by Val Kilmer. If you want to know, he's got the mustache and the hat, and there's a picture of him here that I'm going to show. But he was born on this date in 1851. Deaths on this date in 1848 include Sarah Fuller Adams, English poet and hymn writer. She died on this date. Her best known hymn was a hymn called Nearer My God to Thee, which many of you may be familiar with. It also has its own place in cultural history in that it is supposedly, and there's some question about how accurate this is, but it is supposedly the hymn that the orchestra was playing while the Titanic was sinking. In 1912, that they were playing Nearer My God to Thee as the ship went under. And finally, in 1951, today is the day that William Randolph Hearst died. The runner, he ran the great newspaper empire. And also, William Randolph Hearst is credited with having recognized the importance or the interest in Billy Graham and told his reporters in Los Angeles at the 1949 Los Angeles Crusade to report on him and keep an eye on what this guy was doing and put his revival information on the front page. All right, that's it for things that happened on this date on August 14th, except there's something else that happened, but I can't for the life of me remember what it was. I know I had written it down somewhere. But I can't think of what it was, so I'm going to have to pass. Maybe I'll get to it next week. So that's it. Let's get back to talking about Luke 24. Hopefully we'll finish the book today. I don't know. I have a tendency to take longer when I think I'm going to take shorter, but today, Luke 24, last chapter in the book of Acts. Good morning. Welcome back. We're here today to finish our discussion of Luke. Hopefully we'll get through all of the chapter. Luke 24 is a couple of events, and so there isn't a lot of teaching inherent within the text. So I have a good feeling that we're going to get through the whole chapter and finish the book of Luke today. So, but I'm going to start in verse chapter 23. So if you remember last week when we talked about it, we said that this was a very traumatic time for the disciples. This was like their dreams had been crushed. And at the end of chapter 23, we had the story of the burial of Jesus, how Joseph of Arimathea had gone and asked for the body. We talked about these tombs and that they would go in temporarily for like a year or so, and then they would be moved to the family ossuary. I think is the word. And we find out in verse 55, it said, the women who had come with Jesus from Galilee followed Joseph and saw the tomb and how his body was laid in it. Then they went home and prepared spices and perfumes, but they rested on the Sabbath in obedience to the commandment. So these women, and we know these women from Luke 8, remember we talked about them, Mary Magdalene and a couple of others. They were at the scene. We saw they were at they were on the outskirts of the crucifixion. And they see Joseph of Arimathea take down the body. They see Joseph of Arimathea and his people carry the body from the cross to the tomb, and they see the body put in there. And they realize once the body is put in there, they're close enough to realize that it's not properly laid out. And so they need to do some additional, embalming, not embalming, but they would kind of wrap the bodies up with spices, basically to keep the smell, the decomposing body. So, and they said, well, we're going to come back as soon as we can, which is going to be the day after the Sabbath, to go see, to finish the job, so to speak. Okay. Now, in verse 20, now we're getting into chapter 24. On the first day of the week, very early in the morning, the women took the spices they had prepared and went to the tomb. Now they know where the tomb is because they followed Joseph at the end of chapter 23 and saw where they buried Jesus. Okay, they found the stone rolled away from the tomb. Okay, now there's no explanation given as far as why or who moved this stone. Okay, now I know there's some explanations in some of the other Gospels, and this question, who moved the stone, is an interesting question, a question of apologetics. I know some of you may have seen this book at some point in your life, Who Moved the Stone by Frank Morrison, a guy who just kind of started asking that question, who moved the stone? How did the stone get moved? Okay, and I know in the Matthew account there's some discussion about that, but Luke has no explanation. He just they got there, the stone is moved. Okay, so the women go in and look for the body. But when they entered, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. While they were wondering about this, suddenly, two men in clothes that gleamed like lightning stood beside them. Okay, so they're in there, and all of a sudden, and if they're in the tomb, okay, if you think about it, they're in the tomb doesn't have a light, it's dark. They're looking around for the body, and all of a sudden there's a bright light because you've got two guys in white with clothes that gleam like lightning. Now, clearly, Luke is throwing back to Luke chapter 9. If you remember Luke chapter 9 at the Transfiguration, it says 9:29, as he was praying, that is Jesus, the appearance of his face changed and his clothes became as bright as a flash of lightning. Okay, so clearly Luke is drawing back to this picture, to this story. Okay, so and then later on in the text we find out down in verse 23 they're referred to as angels. Okay, so clearly they recognize that something big is going on here. Okay, Luke recognizes that these are not just two ordinary guys there. Okay. In their fright, the women bowed down with their faces to the ground, but the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here, he is risen. Remember how he told you while he was still with you in Galilee. The Son of Man must be delivered over to the hands of sinners, be crucified, and on the third day be raised again." Verse 8, then they remembered his words. Now, the thought occurs to me, what had they been thinking about? What had they been thinking about? And, I just got finished reading a book called Why Do Minds Change, or How to Change Your Mind, or something. I can't remember the name of it. But the gist of this book was talking about what it takes to get somebody to change their mind. And in terms of getting information in, and basically it says that in a real brief summary, the guy said that there's a we all have kind of a worldview. We are kind of a way that we look at things, and as new information comes in, we assimilate it. We assimilate that information into our bigger worldview. Okay, and I don't mean worldview in the sense of the Christian worldview or the atheist worldview or that kind of thing, but I just think about we just have this perspective, and we just kind of take in stuff, and we assimilate this information, and most of the information that we get, we tuck in, we assimilate it somehow to fit into our own already existing patterns of thinking, and when you get something that is dissonant, that doesn't fit with your way of thinking, you kind of set it to the side in the mind. You kind of just set it to the side. And it isn't until you get a number of these things set to the side that all of a sudden they start to, and then you have to accommodate. So you go from assimilating to accommodating. And when you have to accommodate is when you have to suddenly say, okay, wait a minute, I have to fit these dissident facts, these dissident experiences into my worldview, which means I have to fundamentally change my worldview. Now, if you think about that, you can think about how the disciples and the women and everybody that was following Jesus assimilated everything that Jesus said into their prevailing worldview, that the Messiah was going to be someone who is going to physically rescue, physically redeem Israel from those rotten Romans. Okay, and so all of this stuff, and it, when he started talking about things like I'm going to be cast, I'm going to be dead, et cetera, that all didn't register. So they just kind of set it aside. And now these two men are asking them, why are you still assimilating this? Do you not remember? And now this is that moment when they have to suddenly look at this other information, look at the facts, and they have to accommodate. They have to change their perspective. They have to change their worldview to say, wait a minute, he's not just going to be a king on a throne that's going to kick out the Romans. They had to kind of change their perspective here, and that's exactly what happens. Then they remembered his words. That's the moment when they start putting it together and going, oh, I see, I get it. When they came back from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11, because again, Judas isn't there now, to the 11 and to all the others. It was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the others with them who told this to the apostles. So the apostles, the 11 apostles, again, Judas is not there. We'll find out in Acts that Judas had bought a field and killed himself. And I'm putting together stories from others, but basically that's what happens. And I'll talk more about Judas when I get to Acts. So Judas isn't there, so they have the 11, and then all of these other followers are there. And this is early in the morning. So they're all meeting together, maybe it's first thing in the morning, and these women come bursting in. These are women that have been with them, have been following them. These are ones that went to the tomb, and they said, the tomb is empty, the tomb is gone. It's just like he said. Okay, it was Mary Magdalene, and they told this to the apostles. Okay, verse 11. But they, that is the 11 apostles, and the others with them, did not believe the women, because their words seemed to them like nonsense. Okay? Now, unfortunately, this has become kind of the default position of, male leadership in church these days, that anytime women come in and try to explain what's going on, it's, the words seem like nonsense. I'd love to get into this, but got to finish Luke 24 here. But just imagine things would have gone a little bit better, just a little bit better at this moment had they believed the women at that point. Peter, however, got up and ran to the tomb. Now we know that it's Peter and John. We know that's Peter and John because the John account tells us that. But later on, we'll see that there are more than one that go. Okay, but Peter gets up and runs to the tomb. Bending over, he saw the strips of linen lying by themselves, and he went away, wondering to himself what had happened. What had happened? You know what? He's been told. Now, why doesn't he pick up on it? I don't know. Okay. He's been told. Now, we know from, let me hold off on that thought. Okay. Now we go to verse 13. It's talking about the two disciples on the road to Emmaus. Now, I'm going to tell you something here. This story, really, on the road to Emmaus, is really why I wanted to talk about the Gospel of Luke. It's all because of this particular story. And it has to do with the fact that over the course of the last few years, I have heard this sermon, or a sermon based on this passage 3 times in my church. And all 3 times, I went away from the sermon going, no, and I do that sometimes. I'll just think, no, they're. Now, I'm not sure, maybe you've heard the same 3 sermons that I did, and you said, no, and now you're going to walk away and say 4 times I went, no, but here, let's talk about it anyway. Okay, so now that same day, 2 of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. Okay. Now they don't know exactly what village Emmaus is. All we know it's a village that's about 7 miles. So it's about a 2-hour, 3-hour, give it a 2.5, 3-hour walk. Okay. It would be downhill because Jerusalem is on a hill. It would be downhill, but still give it 2.5. If the average person walks 3 miles an hour, give it. Let's just say it's a 2.5-hour walk. Okay, so these 2 guys are going to Emmaus. Okay, they were talking with each other about everything that had happened. Now, here's the question that never gets asked. Okay, why are these guys going to Emmaus? Why are they on the road to Emmaus? Okay, what possible? The action is all in Jerusalem. That's where the disciples are, the 11 apostles. That's where the men are. That's where everything is happening. Now, suddenly, these 2 guys need to go to Emmaus. Okay, why are they going to Emmaus? Now, we're not given and let me explain this. Let me say this differently. We are not given a reason why these 2 guys needed to go to Emmaus. Now, we can figure out right away, it's not because they're running. Okay, they're not hiding. They're not scared. And how do I know that? Because they're talking. It says, as they talked and discussed these things with each other, that is everything that had happened. In fact, in a few verses earlier, Luke 22:23, when they talk about, remember, Jesus is in the upper room having the Last Supper, and he says, the Son of Man will go as has been decreed, but woe to the man who betrays him. They began to question among themselves which among them it might be who would do this. So that same phrase there, question among themselves, that's the same Greek phrase here as talked and discussed this. So you can imagine there Jesus is there. They're sitting around the table. Who's it going to be? Trying to figure out who it is. And now these 2 guys are walking along the road trying to figure out what happened in Jerusalem. Okay, and so they're talking about it in public. This guy they don't recognize walks up, and I'm getting ahead of myself because I haven't read this stuff, but I'm guessing we all know this story. This guy walks up that they don't recognize, and if they had any fear for their own personal safety, they would not have blurted out, "Oh, well, we're talking about Jesus, and here's who we are, and we're this," So if there was any fear for their personal safety, they wouldn't have done that. But they right away, So there's no fear for their personal safety. So for whatever reason, they decide they need to go back to Emmaus. Okay, these two disciples. Okay. Okay, so as they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them, but they were kept from recognizing them. Okay, they were kept from recognizing. Now notice this is in the passive voice. Okay, that means something is keeping them. Something is keeping them from recognizing Jesus. That had this, whatever this was, they would have recognized him because he looked the same. Okay, I mean, I get that the hands and the feet and all, but facially he would have looked the same. Okay, but they were kept from recognizing him. And I think this is intentional. Okay, this isn't a failure on their part that they don't recognize Jesus. This isn't some indication of some sin or some lack of belief or anything like that. They were intentionally kept, and I think this is something that Jesus was doing because it fits into the bigger purpose of what's happening on this event. There was a story, one of the great probably my top 5 novels I've ever read is the Foundation trilogy by Isaac Asimov. And if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. It's super, super good. There's 3 of them, and in one of the books, I think it's the second book, there's a character who comes in, and I'm not going to, who has, his nickname is the Mule, and he has this telepathic ability that he can reach into a person's mind and like turn a switch on or off to recognize things or don't recognize things. Kind of, it's just sort of flip the switch on, flip the switch off. And he controls people that way. He flicks their switch, he flicks it on, flicks it on, flicks it off. Okay? And I think in a weird sort of way, Jesus, God does this. Somehow or other, he walks up to these guys and he knows, listen, if I don't flick the switch off, they're going to recognize me. But I need them to not recognize me, or I need them not to recognize me. And we'll explain why in a second here. Okay? He asked them, what are you discussing together as you walk along? They stood still, their faces downcast. One of them, Cleopas, asked them, are you the only one visiting Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days? Okay, so I mean, is he being sarcastic? Seriously, where have you been? Okay, or is he truly that incredulous that somebody could have been in Jerusalem and not seen all of this, which clearly indicates how large an event it was. Okay, it wasn't just a small group of disciples wandering around and all, a couple of people being affected. Okay, this was something very visible, very public, and a lot of people were following along with what was going on. Okay, so side note, the Cleopas is the only one that's named. Okay, Cleopas is a shortened version of the male name Cleopatris, which is the male. The female version of that name is Cleopatra. So just, is this person Egyptian? I don't know, but I'm just saying Cleopas, that's this guy's name. Now, the other disciple, we don't know who the other disciple is. Okay, we know it's not one of the 11 because they say they go back to the 11. So is it Cleopas? Is it Cleopas's wife? Could be. We don't know. Okay, it doesn't say it was 2 men. It just says 2 of them. Okay, Cleopas and one other. Okay. Says they were talking with each other as they talked. Okay, it never indicates whether it was 2 men or not. So it could be Cleopas and his wife. Okay, it could be Cleopas and another disciple. Okay, walking along trying to think. Now, if it's Cleopas and his wife, it would make sense because these two, I don't know, maybe they had kids, maybe they had to go, feed the animals, whatever. Get back to Emmaus. Okay, but whatever. So they. Jesus says, do you not know? Okay, what things, he asked. Jesus was like leading them on. What things? About Jesus of Nazareth, they replied. He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. So clearly, they're putting the blame entirely on the chief priests, and the rulers. And that could be the Jewish rulers, that could be the Roman rulers, could be both. Okay, but he's dead. He's gone. Okay. Where was I? But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel, that he was going to save Israel from the nasty Romans. Okay, so again, they're assimilating. They just couldn't assimilate his death in with their pervading worldview. Okay, so, but they didn't, let's see, but we had hoped that he was the one. Okay, and what is more, verse 21, I'm in the middle of verse 21, and what is more, it is the 3rd day since all this took place. In addition, some of our women amazed us. Now, what this tells you is as he goes into this particular part of the story, is you realize that Cleopas and his partner here are connected. They are not exactly insiders, okay, but they are part of the group. Okay, they were there in the room. Okay, so maybe they're part of the 72 that were sent out. Okay, when we get into Acts, we'll find out that there were 120. So they're clearly part of this larger group, not the inner group, but this larger group that was following close enough that they could know who was there and all that kind of stuff. Okay. In addition, some of our women, but they went to the tomb early this morning, but didn't find his body. They came and told us that they had seen a vision of angels. Okay, go back to the earlier passage where we talked about the two men, okay, who said he was alive. Then some of our companions, plural, so this would be Peter and John, went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see Jesus. Okay, so it's interesting. So they're there knowing all of this. Okay, now all of that took place early in the morning. Okay, so I suspect that these guys probably left, I don't know, 11, noon, something like that. Probably around noon, maybe right after lunch, But they did not see Jesus. Now, in verse 25, Jesus is going to, I want to say unload is quite the right word, but actually what Jesus is going to do here is he is going to start the greatest Bible lesson of all time. I mean, can you imagine? These guys have just had a traumatic weekend, they've just had a traumatic weekend. They've just had a traumatic, an intensive couple years, perhaps. And they've had all of the scripture, they've grown up, thrown at them. And now suddenly somebody is going to put it all together for them. He's going to explain it to them in a way that they never could have figured. Okay. And as a result of this, they're going to have to accommodate. They're going to have to change their worldview. Okay. He said to them, verse 25, how foolish you are. So it's a kind of a bold way to start, a rough opening statement. So apparently, though, teaching according to Jesus is you start out by calling your listeners foolish. So I'm not going to do that. But regardless, how foolish you are, Jesus says, and how slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory? Now notice, there's no mention of the fact that Jesus has gone from asking what things happened in Jerusalem to calling them foolish for not understanding what things happened in Jerusalem. But whatever. It says, did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory? And this is the Bible says, and beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. So this was probably the greatest 2-hour Bible lesson ever. Now, if they have VCRs in heaven, DVD players, whatever you call them these days, or DVRs, this and where we can replay history things, this is something I want to see. I want to see this 2-hour lesson. I want to see Jesus explaining to Cleopas and his partner all that happened. Okay, I would love to see these 2 hours. But he's able to put it all together. He's going to say, remember when I said this and then this happened? Remember when I said this and this happened? Remember when I said this and this happened? This. Puts it all together. As they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus continued on as if he were going farther. But they urged him strongly, so stay with us, for it is nearly evening, the day is almost over. So he went in to stay with them. Now this they don't say where they're staying, but that suggests, stay with us, that suggests that they've got a house there, they've got a home there, they've got a place to go, which additionally suggests that it's Cleopas and a wife. Okay? Possibility. Again, it's speculation, but it does fit the facts. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. Then their eyes were opened and they recognized him. Now, some have looked at this and said, oh, well, this is reference back to the Lord's Supper, or the last, lost track of the Last Supper. But all indications were that only the 12 disciples were there, and these guys are not part of the disciples, all right? But regardless, but something about that point, Jesus realized that's the point to come in and switch on. Then their eyes were opened and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. You can imagine that? It's like as soon as you realize, you go, oh, and then poof, gone. They asked each other, were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us? Okay, now burning within us, this is like, like the greatest compliment of a Bible study ever. I mean, nobody as many times as I've taught anything, nobody has ever come up to me afterward and said, man, my heart was burning within me as you were saying that. And please don't send me an email and say, Stan, don't do that now. Okay, this is a great compliment. And I think, and I think that it's a combination of, wow, we should have realized it. But I also think it might, rather than that, the hearts were burning because they thought that they should have recognized him. I think it has more to do with that feeling. Have you ever had a situation where you just can't figure it out? You just can't figure it out. You don't understand it. And you try, you can't understand it. And you meet somebody and that person says, oh, well, here's the solution. And that person puts it all together, lays it out on the line for you and explains it all. And it makes perfect sense. And it just explains everything. Everything makes perfect sense. And that feeling you get of, burning, maybe not burning, but it's just like that explains it. That's it. And I think maybe that's the feeling they were getting at. But regardless, this idea of putting it all together and realizing, wow, I mean, these guys now have the whole story. Okay, think about that. These guys get it. These two, this, and I'm sticking with the husband and wife idea, but these two understand it all. They've got it figured out. Okay. Now, I don't know to what extent, the text doesn't tell us to what extent Mary and the women are talked to. They know the basic idea that they remembered what Jesus said. Maybe they put it together on their own. Okay. And to a certain extent they do, more than the disciples do. But now these guys have had it explained by Jesus. These are the only two guys, couple, that understand it all. Okay, you think about that. They have got it. And so, of course, they understand it. What are you going to do? Well, back to Jerusalem. We got to go back to Jerusalem. Okay? And that's exactly what they do. They got up and returned at once. Now, you think about it. If they left at about 12 or 1 o'clock, something like that, our time, and they walk, it's a 2.5 hour walk. That means they get to Emmaus around 4:30, 5 o'clock, which is right around dinner time. And as they're eating dinner is when Jesus reveals himself to them. And they can get up and walk back in 2.5 hours, so they're back by like 8:30. Because again, it's only a 7-mile walk, which I know for some of us that would be a long walk, but take my word for it, most people can do a 7-mile walk in about 2.5 hours. Okay, maybe 3 hours. Okay, even with a lot of breaks. Okay. They got up and returned at once to Jerusalem. There they found the 11 and those with them assembled together. Okay. Now I'm thinking this would include the women. Okay. And saying, okay, the 11 and the women, this is what they're saying. Okay. So they walk into this. They say, It is true, the Lord has risen and has appeared to Simon. Okay, what is he talking about here? We don't know. Okay, we don't know. In 1 Corinthians, Paul makes a reference, 1 Corinthians 15:5, Paul makes a reference to about the resurrection, that Jesus was resurrected, appeared to the women, then to Paul, or to Cephas, and then to the others. Okay, none of the gospel accounts say anything about that. This is the only reference to it here. Okay. Does it happen between the time that Peter walks away from the tomb earlier in the passage when he's with John? Because at the end of or verse 12 it says, Peter, however, got up, ran, bending over, etc., etc. He went away wondering to himself what had happened. Is it between there and getting back? Well, no, because number one, he's with John. We know that, and then later on. Where was it? Later on it said they didn't find a body, but they did not see Jesus. Then some of our companions went, found it just as the women had said, but they did not see Jesus. Okay, so it had not happened by the time these guys had left. So sometime after the point these guys left Jerusalem and the time they got back, Jesus apparently appears to Peter. Okay, that's all I know. That's all we got. Okay. Then the two told what had happened on the way and how Jesus was recognized by them when he broke the bread. Now these two, okay, again, not the main guys, not you know, not exactly outsiders in the classic sense, but they're not the inner circle. They're going to come in because they didn't believe the women. Now they're going to bring in these other guys. Jesus anoints these other two guys, or appoints these other two guys to bring this, guy, man and woman, to bring this other pair in, or this other information in. And they, according to the longer ending of Mark, they don't believe them either. But something happens here in verse 36. While they were still talking about this, so they're still going back and forth, where the guys, Cleopas and his wife are trying to explain what's going on, Jesus appears in the midst of them and says, "Peace be with you," verse 36. They were startled and frightened, and I would be too. Okay? It's one thing when you see somebody that you're not expecting to see. Oh, didn't expect to see you there. It's certainly when you see somebody who you thought was dead. Okay? That has never happened to me, but I'm not really hoping it does, but you can imagine how surprised you're going to be. They were startled and frightened, thinking they saw a ghost. He said to them, "Why are you troubled, and why do doubts rise in your minds? Look at my hands and my feet. It is I myself. Touch me and see. A ghost does not have flesh and bones, as you see I have." Now notice, no one touches him. There's no record of anyone going, "Yeah, I want to." Okay, so maybe that leads into the next thing. And when he had said this, he showed them his hands and his feet. And while they still did not believe it because of joy and amazement, now this is kind of an interesting, it's like, it's just like, this is too good to be true. Could it be? I don't get it. Jesus decides to ask a very odd request. Got anything to eat? So, you think about it, this great moment in salvation history, in the history of the Bible, in God's plan for humanity, and Jesus is standing there and says, "Hey, you guys got something to eat here?" Okay? And they give him a piece of broiled fish, and he took it and ate it in their presence. Now, some have looked at this and said that he's just doing this to prove he's physical, to prove he's not a ghost, because apparently nobody wants to touch him. So maybe if they see him eat this fish, they'll go, "Okay, yeah, he's really there," and he ate, the fish was there, and we gave it to him, and he ate it, and the fish is gone. So, maybe that's what but it's an odd thing to do, and of course people are going to remember that. The people that are seeing it are going to remember that. He said to them, this is to the 11, and to Cleopas, and to his wife, and to the women, and to the others that are assembled there. "This is what I told you while I was still with you. Everything must be fulfilled that is written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms." Then he opened their minds. Now he does the same thing. Now up in verse, verse 31, he said their eyes were opened and they recognized him. Now this is after Jesus having explained to them for 2 hours what is going on. Now Jesus opens their mind after they having heard these two, the Cleopas and his partner, their explanation of what was going on. And so he puts it all, opens their mind and says, "Okay, there, now you get it. Now there might be some superficial element here, and that's fine. Okay," he opens their mind and says, now you all get it. He told them, "This is what is written. The Messiah will suffer and rise from the dead on the third day, and repentance for the forgiveness of sins will be preached in his name to all nations, beginning at Jerusalem. You are witnesses of these things." Okay, you saw that, you were a witness to this great event. You may not realize it, but you were a witness to a tremendous event. Have you ever seen something happen and it doesn't strike you at the time, but then somebody goes, "Wait, you saw that? You saw that?" Or somebody says, "You realize how important that was?" You kind of got, you were witnesses to the same event. You are witnesses. "I am going to send you what my Father has promised, but stay in this city until you have been clothed with power from on high." So there's something more coming. Something else is coming. Luke doesn't tell us any more about it here. He just says, stay in the city until you have been clothed with power from on high. Now, between verse 49 and verse 50, we know from other gospel accounts that about 40 days pass. Okay, a lot of stuff goes on. Jesus appears to 500 people. So a lot of stuff happens, but after 40 days, there's like a 40-day break. When he had led them out to the vicinity of Bethany, which is, the city of Mary and Martha, he lifted up his hands and blessed them. While he was blessing them, he left them and was taken up into heaven. Then they worshipped him and returned to Jerusalem with great joy, and they stayed continually at the temple, praising God. And thus ends the book of Luke. And interestingly enough, the book of Luke ends where it begins. Because you remember the first story in the book of Luke is about Elizabeth and Zechariah at the temple. It started at the temple. It ends at the temple. Okay. All right. We are done. I finished. I got through the book of Luke. And we're going to be coming back and revisiting some of this as we talk about Acts. I wanted to do a great perspective on Luke, but I just think some of the themes that struck out to me as we went through it is just Luke's emphasis on outsiders. That it's not the people you think, just even in this last story, okay? It's not the people you think who get the first notice of what Jesus had done, okay? It's a group of women at a tomb. It's a husband and wife on the road home to Emmaus, okay? It's not the insiders. It's not the 11, okay? It's not Peter, James, and John. I know we need to see Peter somewhere in there, but it's not the main people. It's not the people you recognize, okay? And so this book was written based on Luke's research into the life and details of the work of Christ. And he continues that, because I don't want to make a grand finale here, because we're going to talk about Acts, which is kind of like Luke part 2. Okay? We're going to talk about Acts, and we're going to get into what Acts is. Now, Acts is a little bit different book, and we'll spend a lot of time talking about that. But thank you all for being with me here as we've been wandering through the Gospel of Luke. And I hope you enjoyed it. And if you have any questions, by all means, ask. Send me an email. And again, don't go sending me emails talking about how your heart was burning based on this, because I won't believe you. I'll say you're lying. And then I'll say, how foolish of you, because that's teaching according to Jesus. I'm kidding about that. So, but thank you very much. And your homework for this week is to read through the book of Acts and try and see if you see any similar themes in Acts that we saw in Luke, because it is most generally believed to be the same author. So read through the book of Acts, and we'll pick it up there. So thank you very much. I appreciate your time, and I'll talk to you later. Wait, I'm back. I remembered what it is. Today is my mother's birthday. She was born in this date in, let me do the math. I believe it's 1982, I think it was, because she's 39. So born in this date, but she was born in New Brunswick, Canada, which makes me half Canadian. So go Canada kind of thing. Happy birthday, Mom.